Hello, my name is Alex, and I'm the production director here at the station. And today I'm going to run through kind of a crude demo of mixing a story in Pro Tools. So basically, the big thing we want is to provide a finished WAV file to the host and managing editor that has a nice, consistent level. There's not a bunch of crazy loud spikes or anything in it. And it's a nicely done. It doesn't need to be super loud, but the important thing is that it's consistent and it makes the mastering that much easier. So I'm going to kind of go through the steps in order to reach that end product of a nice, consistent and stable WAV file. So the first thing we want to do is we want to mix our narration track. Every other track in the story should be relative to that narration track. We don't want our music to be extremely loud and the narration track extremely quiet. And just the key thing to really hammer home is that everything is relative. So if we go over and crank our narration track up 12 because the music is pretty loud as it is, as we can see, this file here is really loud and then our narration is pretty quiet. The solution there is not to crank the fader on the narration or do anything drastic like that. The solution is going to be mixing everything relative to each other, and in order to do that we have to start with the narration track. So we're going to go ahead and solo that, and we're going to leave the fader at 0. We're not going to crank it or anything or dip it down. We're just going to work with it using compression. So in order to get the compressor on there, we go click this top box here, go to Plugin, Dynamics, and down to the Massey CT5 compressor. And the way this works is these two main knobs here are going to first flatten your levels. It's going to bring them to a more consistent level, and then this output will bring up the overall volume. So in order to do that here, we have our track soloed. We're going to listen to it. Unfortunately, this video recording is not going to capture the audio, but you'll be able to see, if you watch the meter here, you'll be able to see where the levels are. So let's listen to it right now without compression, or let's watch it, I suppose, without compression. So it's bouncing in the green there. That's pretty quiet. It's got a decently consistent level. It's not all over the place, but it is too quiet. So we're going to go ahead and compress this first. We always want to start with the compression knob here. So generally speaking, we're going to want to set the compress level between probably about 4 and 8. With a voice track, that's usually a good range to work with. But again, it's all dependent on how you recorded this. If you have a really quiet voice track, you're going to need to compress it more. So if we look at this narration track, it looks to be fairly quiet. This waveform is pretty small, so we're probably going to need to compress this a fair amount. So I'm going to eyeball this again. I'm sorry there's no audio. We're going to go ahead and bring this to 8, and then let's play it and let's see how consistent the levels are. So now it's kind of bouncing in the same area. That's good. We can see the compression is working, but our level is way too quiet. That's basically inaudible down there. So what we're going to need to do is bring up the output so that the volume is brought back up after the compression has taken place. So with this, it again is all dependent on how loud the track is. If the waveform is huge, you're probably not going to need to bring it up so much. But since this is a quieter waveform, we're going to bring it up a fair amount. And the goal is to get the voice track between -5 decibels and +5 decibels, which is, generally speaking, this yellow range. So if you can get the level bouncing consistently in this yellow range right here, that's a very nice level for your narration, and that leaves you plenty of headroom to mix everything else. So we're still not there yet. Let's play it back again here. Okay, so let's bring up the level. We'll bring it up to about 24. That looks like that's bouncing fairly consistently in the yellow. So that looks like a good level. Attack and release. For voices, you generally want to leave that at both of them at fast, so that's good how it is. And blend here, the blend knob is simply how much of this compressor plugin is applied to your to the track that you're working with. So this, generally speaking, you want it on full. If you want to do some fine tuning, you can adjust this to maybe 50%, but really don't worry about that. And also don't worry about the limiting button. You're not going to be using that. So fast, fast, excuse me, and blend at full, and the compression and output knobs. Compress you want between, generally speaking, 4 and 8, and the output is totally dependent on where your levels are bouncing on the meter. So you set those, that's a good level. Now you have a solid narration track that is bouncing on the meter nicely and sounds pretty consistent. Now we can go ahead and mix everything else relative to it. Okay, so we have our narration track compressed and it sounds pretty consistent. That's a good level that we'll use to mix everything, and we'll use that track as kind of our standard here. We'll mix everything else around that track. But for demonstration purposes, I'm not going to go through and mix all these individual tracks because the audio will not come through on the video here. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to probably add compression to your interview track, since that's something you recorded yourself. So again, the Massey CT5, load that and compress that. If the track is still too loud or something after compression, you can use the fader to dip down the level. But generally speaking, you're not going to want to use the fader to boost your level. You should rely on compression to do that. So you'll go through each one of these and you'll mix it relative to the narration track. And if that, if that requires compression or equalization, you can go ahead and do that. But the big goal is that everything is relative to the narration track, so everything has a nice balance to it. So let's pretend I went through and I compressed all these. I've got compression settings on them. I'm going to go ahead and just very hastily set these. But you'll want to make sure that you're not over compressing or anything like that. You want everything to sound pretty consistent without sounding completely dead. So we've got that set. Music, generally speaking, if it's off of a CD, it's already going to be mastered and compressed, so you probably won't need to use any compression on music. You'll just adjust the fader so that the volume is relative to your other tracks. So yeah, anything that's already been mastered, you can guarantee has already been compressed and is even. Now this music track, does not look too consistent, so we would want to compress this. But anything mastered professionally on CD or something like that, and you'll be able to see it through the waveform, but it'll be very consistent and pretty flat, and you will not need to compress it or anything. You'll just adjust the fader so that the levels are relative. So for our purposes, I won't mess with that. So we have all our tracks mixed, everything's compressed, everything's relative to the narration, and now we are ready to bounce. So what we're going to do is we're going to enable all of our tracks here, and we're going to add a stereo master fader. So we're going to do that by hitting Shift Apple N, or you can go up to Track, New, and you're going to go and select Stereo Master Fader, and you're going to hit Create. And that's going to pop up. It's also going to pop up in your mixer over here. And over in your mixer, you're going to select a plugin slot there. Go to Multi-Channel Plugin, Dynamics, and go to L2007 Mastering Limiter. And what this does is this is going to bring the level of all the tracks in your project, and it's going to bring them up in volume and set a brick wall so that nothing exceeds whatever wall you set. So for stories, we're going to want to set the wall or the max output at 6. This is minus 6 decibels, and that's a good level for your stories before being mastered. You don't want the stories to be completely full volume, screaming loud before they're mastered. That happens in the mastering process. But as a story with multiple tracks, you still need to do some kind of, I guess, pseudo mastering so that the track is workable for the host and managing editor. So we're going to set the wall at 6. We do not need to mess with the mode or the release. We'll keep those at loud and normal. And we're going to set the threshold. The threshold is the knob that determines how much everything is brought up by. Generally speaking, between 15 and 9 is usually good. Anything beyond 15, and it really doesn't sound very good. It's squashing it almost too much. It's pushing things so that it's meeting the brick wall way too hard. So again, this is something you want to listen to. I apologize that we can't get audio on this, but we'll just watch the meter here on the master fader. We'll set this at 15, and let's watch what happens. So as you can see, nothing is exceeding -6 here. It's set that brick wall, and everything's running into it in the story. Now, if we adjust this threshold, if we bring it down more, you'll see that it's not constantly hitting the brick wall. It's a little quieter. So generally speaking, we still want the waveform to be bouncing as it is, but we don't want it bouncing this much. We don't want this much dynamic range. We definitely want to bring it up so that it is hitting that brick wall, because that's telling us that it is getting to that volume. If you go way too far, you'll see that it's just basically hugging the brick wall. And as you see here on the plugin, the reduction is insane. And that's going to sound pretty bad. So generally, we want to go between 15 and 9, but again, it depends on the project. If you record everything right and mix everything right, this range generally will serve you well. So for not being able to hear it, this looks pretty good. This is meeting the wall, and it's not bouncing around too much. It looks to be a pretty consistent level. The host and managing editor will be very pleased to be working with a waveform that is bounced like this. So again, I didn't thoroughly mix this. I just did a quick demonstration, but that is how you're going to set your master fader. You're going to set, so once the limiter is set, you are ready to bounce, and you're going to select the first and last things of your project, so that, and obviously make sure everything's enabled that you want in the final track. And you're going to go ahead and go up to File, Bounce to, and Disk. And the settings here, generally speaking, the interface, or excuse me, the bounce source will be set correctly. The file type, you always want to do WAVE. And the format you want to set to stereo interleaved. You don't want it mono. Even if you're working with just a single voice track, you're still going to want that stereo master fader, the limiter, and then bounce to stereo. Because when these things are broadcasted, they get summed to mono with the equipment that is in the DJ booth. So we don't want to do that twice. We want to keep this as a stereo track. So stereo interleaved. Bit depth we want to keep at 16, and we want 44.1. Convert during bounce is good. And we're ready to bounce. And this track will bounce. We'll save it wherever we want to save it. And then we can send the host and managing editor a nice, consistent waveform that is not exceeding -6 decibels. And then they can work with that. And that way the overall episode will be nice in levels, and it will sound good going over the air.